At my signal, unleash hell.
Unleash hell is certainly not a typical phrase of a pagan Roman general from the 2nd century after Christ. Hell, in fact, is a concept developed by Christian culture. Of course, at the time, there were the concepts of Tartarus and the underworld, but they were not comparable to our hell. This is just one of the many inaccuracies in Gladiator. We will discover about 10 together, and at the end I will tell you who the real historical figure was that inspired Gladiator. So welcome to Historicatit, and let's begin. The film opens with one of the most beautiful ancient battle scenes in the history of cinema. The entire staging truly conveys the idea of Rome's organized power, its equipment, its soldiers, its discipline, its tactics, the war machines. There are even war dogs, although in this case it's a wolf, but normally molossers were used in battle. The use of the blue filter also gives us the sense of the cold of that frontier. We are indeed on the Danube in 180 AD, and Rome is facing the Marcomanni and the Quadi, populations pressing on the empire's frontiers. As beautiful and quite historically accurate as it is, if we look at the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, which depicts these campaigns against the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians, there are actually some inaccuracies, or at least it's unclear, for example, what the role of Maximus Decimus Meridius is. That is, he is clearly the leader of the army, the general. But we see that Marcus Aurelius is present on the battlefield.
Marcus Aurelius is the emperor, and the emperor is exactly this, the head of the army, the imperator.
So it makes no sense for there to be another man commanding the army instead of the emperor. Normally this happened with the system of legates, when the emperor was not on the battlefield and thus delegated a legatus delegate or someone invested with his power, another man who then commanded the army. As much as it is true that the historical figure who inspired Maximus Decimus Meridius was indeed the chief of staff on the Danube during the battles against the Sarmatians and other peoples of that area. So, in short, Maximus' role is not very clear. Additionally, there is the presence of other high-ranking officers, other generals, so it's not very clear why all these officers, all these great commanders for a single army. The assassination of Marcus Aurelius by Commodus is clearly a historical falsehood. It is a historical falsehood that serves the plot, of course. Why? Because this way we immediately hate Commodus, who is somewhat the villain of the film. However, in reality, Marcus Aurelius was not killed by his son, rather he died of illness. He died from that very illness, the Antonine Plague, which was probably smallpox, one of the major omissions of this film, which we will discuss later. However, there is an ironic point to highlight. In this film, Marcus Aurelius is suffocated to death by his son Commodus. In reality, it will not be Marcus Aurelius, but Commodus himself who dies from suffocation. He will indeed be strangled by his bodyguard, a former gladiator named Narcissus. Furthermore, the entire part where Marcus Aurelius wants to return the Republic to the Romans is completely ahistorical, not to say absurd. For an emperor, the idea that the Republic no longer existed and needed to be returned to the people would never have been conceivable, because one of Augustus's great legacies was precisely the continuity or the illusion of continuity between the Republic and the Empire. This info è istinto a the Furthermore, it is very strange to see Marcus Aurelius disempower his son Commodus, because it will be Marcus Aurelius himself, the emperor, who will interrupt the practice of adoption, replacing it with a dynastic principle. In fact, until Marcus Aurelius, the emperors before him had chosen their successor from the best candidate, let's say. Instead, Marcus Aurelius will designate his son Commodus as his heir, defying any adoptive principle. Let's also talk about Lucilla, whom we see arriving at the camp with Commodus in the first act. She was a bit different from how she is portrayed in the film. First of all, she was very ambitious. She had indeed been the wife of Lucius Verus and was a widow. And she had already remarried at this point in the story, precisely to that historical figure who inspired Maximus Decimus Meridius, and whom she deeply hated. She and her husband were indeed present at the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, and years later, Lucilla conspired against her brother Commodus, and for this she was discovered and exiled to the island of Capri, where Commodus later had her killed.
Passiamo a un errore che non è un errore, ovvero andando avanti col film, appunto Massimo viene tradito da Commodo e finisce schiavo, diventa un gladiatore, eccetera eccetera, e viene chiamato, soprannominato nell'arena Ispanico, e ho trovato molte persone protestare contro questo soprannome, dicendo che avrebbe dovuto chiamarsi Iberico, perché all'epoca la Spagna era chiamata Iberia. Beh, in realtà non è esatto. L'Iberia era chiamata Ispania dai Romani. Troviamo questo nome già citato da Tito Livio, perché era il nome che proveniva dal cartaginese. I cartaginesi erano stati i primi conquistatori della Spagna e poi i Romani l'avevano conquistata a loro volta durante le guerre puniche. Quindi Ispanico era un soprannome perfettamente legittimo. Ecco, ora c'è un errore che avrebbe annullato completamente tutta la trama del film. Ovvero, a un certo punto Massimo e i suoi compagni gladiatori vengono riportati a Roma per poter combattere nell'anfiteatro Flavio. Beh, esisteva una pratica a Roma, e magari degli esperti di legge romana potranno confermare o contraddire nei commenti, che si chiamava post liminum. Era una pratica che poi era stata codificata da Silla in una legge. In pratica, qualsiasi cittadino romano che era stato fatto prigioniero e reso schiavo durante una guerra, una volta che rientrava entro i confini di Roma, della città di Roma, riacquistava la libertà e tutti i diritti politici. Quindi in realtà Massimo, una volta sbarcato a Roma, avrebbe dovuto uscire dall'edificio dove stavano i suoi compagni gladiatori e andarsene via libero. Sempre a Roma assistiamo all'unico accenno alla grande assente di questo film, la peste antonina. Infatti Comodo arriva a Roma e durante l'udienza del Senato si accenna a una peste nel quartiere greco. Beh, in realtà la peste antonina fu un'epidemia ben più colossale di una semplice malattia nel quartiere greco. In realtà colpì tutto l'impero, imperversò per anni, era molto probabilmente il vaiolo, e a Roma arrivò a fare 2000 morti al giorno. Quindi è molto strano che non solo non se ne parli mai e che il paesaggio della città non sia minimamente influenzato dalla presenza di questa malattia, ma che una volta che la si vede riemergere nel quartiere greco non ci sia alcun tipo di allarme nel Senato. Ed eccoci finalmente arrivati al Colosseo, l'anfiteatro Flavio, che però non era affatto chiamato Colosseo come nel film all'epoca. Certo, qui Ridley Scott utilizza il nome Colosseo per rendersi più comprensibile al pubblico, soprattutto al pubblico americano. Ma all'epoca appunto il Colosseo era chiamato Anfiteatro Flavio. Il nome Colosseo è venuto più avanti. Ci sono 4 ipotesi sulla sua origine. La più accreditata è che il nome provenga dalla vicinanza con il Colosso di Nerone, una grande statua modellata sulle statue del dio Sole, e che aveva fatto nascere l'espressione ad colossum eo, vado al colosso, e quindi poi Colosseo.
Finally, the thing is that the film takes us into the Colosseum. There are immediately a lot of inaccuracies, but above all, some truly modern inventions. And the most famous of all is thumbs up or thumbs down to spare or not the life of a gladiator. Well, this practice never existed in Rome. In reality, it is a modern invention, probably dating back to an 1872 painting by Jérôme called Polis Verso. In reality, Seo emissarei che there was a gesture that emperors could make to spare or not spare a gladiator's life. It was the thumb inside the fist, which meant to sheath the sword, or the thumb horizontal or up with the hand extended, which meant to kill. Let's move on to the second Hollywood invention about gladiators, which is the greeting Ave Caesar Morituri, Se Salutant, now very famous, but in reality, the gladiators did not say it. We have only one account of this salute made to Emperor Claudius. Suetonius reports it, if I remember correctly, during a naval battle, and it was not spoken by gladiators, but by those condemned to death. And who was the real Maximus Decimus Meridius, the gladiator from Ridley Scott's film? In reality, his name was Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, and he was a great soldier from Antioch who married Lucilla by the will of Marcus Aurelius when she became a widow of her husband Lucius Verus, because Marcus Aurelius wanted to associate him with the empire. But Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus refused to associate himself with the empire. In fact, in his life, he refused power several times. That is, after the death of Marcus Aurelius, when Lucilla conspired against Commodus, he stayed away from it. And this saved his life because Lucilla was discovered and then was killed in exile by her brother. But then 2 more times,
after the death of Commodus, when Pertinax, who had been his subordinate during the Marcomannic Wars, asked him to become emperor, and he refused. And then when Didius Julianus, Pertinax's successor, wanted to associate him with the empire, and he refused again. And considering the fate of these two emperors, we can say he was very far-sighted. Thank you for making it this far. I remind you that this is not intended as a critique of the film, but as a way to discover the history through the film, which I actually consider a very beautiful and moving work by Ridley Scott with a splendid soundtrack. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. If you didn't like it, thank you for watching anyway.